I've been told by team producers here, because I know very little about football, that Manchester City and Manchester United are sworn rivals. But could the fight against the PC Brigade finally bring these two famous clubs together? Well, a campaign's underway pushing for the scrapping of both clubs' respective crests, as they feature three-mast ships. Apparently, the ship represents, as Guardian columnist Simon Hattenstone suggested, a crime against humanity because of the city's links to the slave trade. But in fact, the ship is a tribute to Manchester's Ship Canal, opened in 1893, 55 years after the abolition of slavery, not to mention the fact that both clubs were established after abolition too. But perhaps more than that, the Lancastrians avidly protested in support of the North during the American Civil War against the slave trade. So something doesn't quite add up here. With me now to discuss this is Femi Nylander, the activist and filmmaker. Femi, thank you for coming in. Isn't the idea that having a ship on a crest is automatically linked to the slave trade just wrong?
Well, I don't think there is really a campaign underway. There was an article in The Guardian, and in that article it mentioned that one writer had written in going, "Oh yes, I agree, I've been talking about this for years." There's no evidence that there's a campaign going on around this, really. There were campaigns going on about Cecil Rhodes, around Colston, who got pulled into the river, and I think that those are much more clear and obvious glorifications of the history of slavery. This, I think, is an example of where someone has written an article about something a bit superfluous, and all of these media institutions have got an opportunity to say, "Oh, look at the woke mob. Aren't any calls for reparations completely crazy? Isn't it all crazy?" What's not crazy, for example, is the fact that a personal friend of yours, I think, Richard Drax, who is a very, very, very wealthy MP, made his whole fortune and inherited his whole fortune and his plantations off.
Well, he didn't. He didn't make any of this money.
No, he inherited it.
Inherited from things that happened hundreds of years ago. And it's. Do you really have to think it's right to visit the sins of the fathers upon the sons?
I think that this is a very, very. If people in the Caribbean now are currently poor because of what Richard Drax's ancestors did. He is one of the wealthiest men in Britain because of what his ancestors did. But if I steal your pocket watch, I'm not saying you have one. If you did have one, if I steal it and then I give it to my son, and we both know I stole it, my son knows I stole it, your son knows he stole it, he comes back and says, "Can I have it back?"
Does this begin to be true, that whether countries are rich or poor now doesn't depend on what happened 200 years ago, it depends on decisions made by their current governments, and current governments can't blame events of hundreds of years ago for their failures of economic policy?
I don't think at all that's the case, because 200 years, one, is not a very long time. If an individual family, as I say, Richard Drax is still rich as an individual after 200 years, then a country
look at a country like South Korea, which was a colony of Japan before and up to the end of the Second World War, has since then made itself enormously rich by a successful industrial effort, a successful work ethic, and free trade.
I mean, you could say that South Korea became enormously rich by being an ally of powers that were enormously rich during the Cold War. South Korea and North Korea, obviously, were both.
Well, North Korea being in the communist sphere has remained extremely poor, and the country that has been a free market country has done very well. And
the Caribbean, in recent years,
and Cuba is very poor because it's attached itself to the communists.
Cuba's life expectancy is longer than the life expectancy of the USA, despite the USA being very rich. So free market capitalism isn't always great when you can have if you can't get free healthcare for your own citizens. Nonetheless, if you look at the Caribbean in recent years and the relationship that the Caribbean has had with Western countries in recent years, the structural adjustment loans of the 1980s, which basically said, we enslaved your people for decades, for centuries, we dragged them over to this part of the world, and now you owe us debt. Now you need to pay debt to us, and you need to pay interest on that debt.
It was lent to them.
It was lent to them after they were de-developed, and so it's fine to ask people for money that you've lent to them back, but it's not fine to ask for money back when it's been stolen from you. It's fine for me to say the descendants.
No money was stolen.
No. It's fine.
No money was stolen.
The slave trade was not about theft. Are you saying that stealing people's labour isn't theft? If I make you work for me for free for 30 years...
The slave trade was evil, and it was stopped.
Was it theft?
It was stopped by the British Empire.
Was it theft?
The slave trade was
stealing someone's labour
trade.
Theft? That's my question to you, Jacob. If I enslave you and I force you to work your whole life, am I stealing your labour?
If you look at the commandments, to defraud the labour. The worker is worthy of his hire. That is a teaching of Christ. So I'm very happy to accept that. But the issue here is that the British Empire stopped slavery in 1807. We banned it in the British Empire some years later
trading force in the history of human history.
These countries must now be standing on their own two feet.
So
they can't go back 200 years.
Why should descendants of Caribbean people whose leaders, a lot of them installed by Western countries, pay back loans that they took out, but descendants of people who enslaved Caribbean people pay back...
The loans were being paid back that were taken out a few years before. These aren't yet loans that were hundreds of years old.
These loans are decades old.
They're a few decades.
They're a few decades old, and they were often...
modern loans taken out by the legitimate, valid, democratic government.
I mean, if you actually look at the history of the Caribbean, a lot of these leaders have been installed. They've been installed, and there have been coups. It's the same story in Africa, same story in Latin America. You have various coups which are supported by Western regimes. Nonetheless, do you genuinely believe that an MP in the UK, I mean, he's a good friend of yours, there's pictures online of you eating ice cream with him.
Indeed,
have you ever challenged him and said, okay, cool, great, you have mountains and mountains of wealth, and we know where that wealth comes from. It's traceable. You inherited a plantation.
I think this argument is absolutely nonsensical.
A plantation. He inherited a plantation.
And there are people in England who got land from the dissolution of the monasteries, and there are people descended from the Normans who invaded.
If you sat on, I mean, your own wealth, I mean, I know you're very... You have quite a bit yourself.
But these things are hundreds of years old.
Your granddad was a lorry driver. You're not necessarily a descendant of a slave owner. If you were a descendant of a slave owner, if you knew that your own personal private wealth was built off death and destruction and slavery and torture and murder and drowning and torture, would you want to give it back? If you knew that people on the other side of the world were dirt poor, because they are the descendants.
The reason countries are poor now is not to do with what was happening in the beginning of the 19th century.
That's why all the countries that did the colonising and enslaving are rich, and all the countries which were colonised and enslaved, or most of them, are poor now.
But this isn't even accurate. And look what Gordon was doing in Khartoum when he was trying to stop the slave trade as a Britain going out to stop...
Do you want to talk about Khartoum? You want to talk about Sudan and Britain? Do you want to talk about the colonisation of Sudan and Britain? Churchill himself writes in his diary
to stop the
saying
slave trade
I enjoyed shooting Sudanese people.
The slave trade was being carried out in Sudan by the people who were living there, and the British were trying to stop it.
No one is saying that slavery didn't exist throughout human history.
That's really important.
Do you deny that Britain ran the biggest slave trade in the history of humankind?
But we stopped it.
No, but do you deny that? If I steal from the most people in London, then I stop it. Or if I rape the most number of women, then I stop it.
We not only stopped it, we stopped other countries from carrying out the slave trade.
Which other countries did you stop?
Oh, if you look at what some Palmerston speeches in the early 19th century, we're trying to stop Portugal from doing it, we're trying to stop the United States from doing it, we're trying to stop the Royal Navy.
So the abolitionist movement,
the trade in slavery.
The abolitionist movement, and also the United States was the brainchild of the United Kingdom.
Well, no, they fought against us.
They revolted. But who went over and killed all the indigenous people? Who are the United States?
If you look at that,
is full of the descendants of Europeans.
If you look at the behaviour of the US and the behaviour of Canada, the British Empire behaves much better to the indigenous population in Canada, much better.
Set the stones of the political philosophy which underpinned the US system of slavery.
I'm not trying to defend the United States. You can get Americans to do that, but the behaviour of the British in Canada was much better in terms of the indigenous people than the United States was. So I'm afraid we've run out of time, but this has been a brilliant conversation. Thank you so much, Femi, for coming on.